The last mobile game you played had a story. You don't remember it. You tapped through every line without reading a word. And the studio that made it? They designed the narrative, but the mistake they made is they designed it like a movie. Early in my career, we brought on a screenwriter for a mobile RPG. She had a great resume and was paid well. She wrote a full story bible, backstories, plot twists, emotional arcs. We put it in as cutscenes between levels. Guess what the average time was on each story screen? Under half a second. We could have replaced every cutscene with a blank screen, and the metrics wouldn't have changed. That's what happens when you treat game narrative like a screenplay. You get a screenplay. And nobody came to your game to watch a movie. So we stripped it. We pulled every cutscene and every dialogue screen, tied the narrative to the progression loop instead. Every upgrade changed something visible in the game world. No text, no exposition. The session length went up, and players started describing the story in reviews. The story they were describing was just the progression system. But because they were playing it instead of reading it, it felt like theirs. That's what game narrative is. Everything else is decoration. There are 3 types of narrative structure in games, and studios screw up all 3. Linear is a guided path. One story, one sequence. When it's done wrong, it's the easiest to skip. But when it's done right, it's some of the best storytelling in the medium. Uncharted and The Last of Us are both linear. They had no branching and no player choice. But the narrative is woven so tightly into the gameplay that you never feel like a passenger. You feel like you're inside the story. The problem isn't linear structure. It's studios that use linear as an excuse to separate story from gameplay. Cutscene, then level, then cutscene. That's not a linear narrative. That's a slideshow with a game attached. Branching gives players choices that change outcomes. In The Witcher 3, how you treat Ciri in a handful of key moments determines which ending you get. But most branching narratives don't fail because the writing is weak. They fail because the branches are fake. A colleague of mine worked on a project where they pitched branching to the publisher. What they shipped was 3 dialogue options leading to the same scene. They thought players wouldn't notice. The players noticed in the first session. Fake choice is worse than no choice. It teaches the player that nothing they do matters. Emergent has no script. The stories arise from systems interacting. The mechanics create the moments, not the writers. Most teams default to linear because it's controllable, but controllable and memorable are almost never the same thing. Hades understood something most studios don't. Replayability is an architecture decision you make on day 1. They built a loop where death was the story. Every run gives you fresh dialogue, new relationships, and hidden lore. The narrative rewards repetition because it was designed for repetition from the start. And underneath all 3, the silent killer, tonal contradiction. Not the obvious kind, where the character says one thing and the gameplay says another. The subtle kind, where the narrative tone and the core loop's emotional rhythm are pulling in opposite directions. We had a game with a heartfelt story about rebuilding a village. The core loop was a timed puzzle with fail states every 45 seconds. The story said, "Relax and care about this place." But the gameplay said, "You're failing, hurry up." The players didn't dislike the story. They just felt stressed for reasons they couldn't name. When we changed the timer to a move counter, retention jumped 11%. The narrative didn't change. We just stopped contradicting it. Homescapes made over $1 billion. It is a match 3 puzzle game with no combat, no voice acting, and no branching. But every level restores a room, and the match 3 progress becomes narrative progress. You can't separate the story from the game, because they're the same thing. After 12 years, it's always the same pattern. If your player can skip the narrative and enjoy the game just as much, you don't have a game narrative. You have a screenplay sitting next to a game. And players always skip the screenplay.